We are waiting for our learners. In coming 2 minutes, we are going to start this session. Naved, can you please help me to find out where is the recording button? I could not find out right now.
Ma'am, it is now recording. You have already selected the recording.
Okay, okay. Thanks a
Yeah.
lot. Okay. So, in today's discussion, we are going to talk about basically perspectives or approaches through which we try to conduct the whole study. So, in today's session, we are going to cover uh, fifth and sixth unit from block number second. Uh, as we have already spoken about types of descriptive research and experimental research, but we have not discussed perspectives in general, and there are many things that are supposed to discuss one by one so that we can differentiate why we try to understand to create a kind of fine balance between subjectivity and objectivity, because whenever we are saying it a kind of scientific investigation, most of the time we tend to look at science, but the problem with the social sciences in general and rural development in particular is that there are lots of things that are subjective in basic nature. For instance, concept of vulnerability is quite different for village communities living in Indian society, and it is going to be completely contrast for those communities those are living in Afghanistan. Why? Because they have different kind of infrastructure, and in case of Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, there are not a significant problem of irrigation supply for water. Neither there is any scarcity of that drinking water. But in Afghanistan, fetching that drinking water or irrigation facility, those are quite different things. So when we try to define vulnerability or the areas, prime areas for which we are trying to focus on rural development, basically the whole almost every topic is going to be completely different for those contextual understandings. So, whenever we try to study this uh, research in social sciences in general and rural development in particular, we have to focus on how are we going to create a balance between empiricism and reason. We have already discussed about two components of social research uh, that makes our study scientific and as well as productive for development perspective. First is logical validity of your theory or your perspective, and the other is empirical validity. So again, we are going to again talk about that, but this time we are going to use for our understanding through several perspectives that can be used in these researches. And it is why are we going to do that? Just because, like sciences, typical sciences like physics, chemistry, zoology, botany, physics, you can't say that there can be in the social sciences you can't equate that kind of study because in sciences you can discover laws. But in social sciences, despite of all those studies, you can't go for universal laws. You can't claim that you are doing these studies for the discovery of laws. Why? Because not a single principle or law is going to be applied for all societies in general, whether it is American society or it is Afghanistan or it is India. So the thing that we have to consider is in social research in general, and in particular case of rural development, we can't generalize this kind of findings. So there is a big difference between scientific inquiry and investigation when we do that in typical sciences that are dedicated to the study of natural phenomenon. But here we are talking about social phenomena, social phenomenon, and that are every time going to give us somewhat new experience in terms of empirical inquiry. That is why this reason has to be balanced with the empirical inquiry, and that is why we can't say that there is one full and final perspective is going to be our sole guiding perspective to understand facts, because facts are facts only in sciences. Here, in social sciences in general and rural development in particular, these facts may be going to be completely different, just because the context of a society, the context of that cultural setting, the context of that understanding is going to be completely changed. The meaning of every word can be completely changed. The meaning of a particular gesture can be completely changed. In one society, touching hand can be very greeting kind of experience, but in the other society, without realizing those social norms and their values, greeting a lady by a male just by shaking hand, particularly when the lady is a stranger, it can ruin that whole process of communication, because these meanings are completely different due to their different nature of or variable that are found in everyday life of meaning, values, and norms. So, here, our prime purpose is to talk about those perspectives that are actually trying to develop a kind of alternative perspective as compared to that strictly scientific approach that we call in general positivistic approach. So in positivistic approach, where all the emphasis is set on scientific investigation for the conclusion in terms of observable facts, and particularly those are facts that are objective in nature. But in social sciences in general and rural development in particular, this objectivity has to be balanced with the subjective understanding of our social phenomenon, of our subjects, of every society or in which we are conducting that particular study. So, the basic nature of empirical inquiry in case of a positivistic approach, while in case of other approaches that we are going to use, and we are going to discuss about those approaches one by one, it has to be completely different, and we are going to understand the basic difference. So here we have to understand again, because of this empirical research process, the overall no, we can't say that one particular methodology or one particular perspective is going to be all the time very productive and profitable for our researchers. No, we cannot say. That is why we are going to discuss all those perspectives that are actually evolved gradually, one by one, providing us alternative methodologies, so that we can focus on our subjects for objectively understanding their meanings, their perspectives, and side by side, we are also evolving in our own perspective as a researcher. So, this study where we are actually trying to cover diverse social aspects of society in terms of rural development, in particular terms of rural development, there is a need to understand a fine line of scientific investigation between positivistic approach and through approaches that are actually providing alternative perspectives to our understanding. So that is why we can say that whenever we are going to talk about this kind of social research or scientific investigation in social research area, that means we are we are supposed to working on certain conceptual categories, and that is why we have to evolve analytical frameworks apart from in bereft of that particular analytical framework and that conceptual category, we will not be able to locate our facts that actually that we have concluded in our study. Because again, this is not a particular science in strict terms. It is social science where value and fact are not two different things. Value and fact have to be in a balanced kind of dynamism. Only then we can understand the meaning of a particular social phenomenon, and that is why we are here trying to understand what are key methods of social research, how we try to look at those various diverse social aspects of rural development by using phenomenological perspective rather than scientific methods, because scientific methods can be very prolific for discovery of laws, but I'm sorry, but in case of this kind of social research area or social aspects of development, particularly in rural communities, that objectivity is never going to help us, because every society is different from area to area, even within one geographical framework. Like even if you talk about Afghanistan, there is a wide difference between the topography of those provinces. So you have to understand that kind of phenomenology. Why? Because when we are talking about a positivistic perspective, that is strictly in terms of observable facts and facts that can be reiterated, that can be verified, like numbers. But in phenomenological perspective, we can't just uh, focus on quantitative understanding, because the qualitative understanding is missing. So despite of being a good study, it is going to be an incomplete study, in the sense that it is not going to help us what is the missing link, that is the subjective terms of that particular phenomenon. So the basic difference between scientific method, or you call it positivistic perspective, versus phenomenology. Phenomenology is basically providing a kind of alternative to this positivistic methodology, where we think that the response of a matter is can be categorized always. Phenomenology says that here the subject, uh, that is individual from different societies, those are the subjects, and that subject cannot be respond always in categories. Why? Because uh, you don't have that particular knowledge. Your knowledge is limited. In scientific method based positivistic perspective, they don't see that their perspective is actually limited. But phenomenology basically stands on this pillar, that all the priori knowledge cannot be helpful for your understanding. That means you are going to start your own completely a kind of error free, bias free empiricism for that particular experience that is actually part of one particular phenomena. So in phenomenological and critical research, researcher is first of all prepared to abandon the positivistic line of thought, and then the basic importance is that the researcher has to disapprove all a priori knowledge and rest solely on experience and induction. This has to be the foremost important thing of today's discussion. So kindly try to understand this point. When you are going to say that everything that you know from either your studies or from your experiences, that ceased to be a part of that particular subject. Why? Because that is a kind of thing where you are supposed to go for a particular philosophy. A particular philosophy, that means phenomenology is all about philosophy behind that knowledge. Knowledge that is basically a subject is going to create. That means it is not us, the researcher, who are full of knowledge. Rather, the subject that is available in the field is full of knowledge, and we have to understand how they look at their own at their own social phenomenon through their perspective. This is the basic pillar of phenomenological perspective, and that gives a complete contrast from that particular scientific methodology of positivistic perspective. So, in this empirical inquiry, phenomenology is basically going to put an emphasis on number one, induction, and number two, use of direct observation. But this direct observation has to be completely free from all your previous experiences and all knowledge that you have acquired in prior to that particular social phenomenon. And that is the basic challenge, because we have to understand that these human beings are not just matter. For instance, in a particular laboratory, in physics lab or in chemistry lab, you can have so many radicals or other salts, and you can observe your response by putting this kind of salt or that kind of radical on a particular matter. That means it is one thing that is clear, that you have a fixed number of salts, you have a fixed number of radicals. But in case of human beings, can we categorize that there are just three types of salts or there are just three types of factors? In this particular area of social research in general and rural development in particular, the whole understanding is going to be completely complex. Why? Because there are multiple factors where society and culture, their meanings, their rules, and their norms, everything is completely different, and actually they are getting completely different outlook from their own experiences. How are you going to uniform that all variance just by saying that you are doing this investigation for the discovery of laws? Because this kind of inquiry won't lead to any kind of discovery of any laws. So first of all, we have to challenge that these subjects of social research inquiry are actually subjective by nature rather than objective. That means their culture, their society, their understandings, their meanings, their norms, their values are going to be completely different. So that is why the problem came, and that is why it is also one has to be very clear cut, like a researcher. For instance, myself, I am going to discuss and to study Afghanian culture in a particular province, that means I have to be aware about their norms and their values and their cultural significance, their practices, their every practice has some sort of meaning to them. So, unless and until a researcher, who's basically the outsider, is not going to socialize, how can you understand the meaning of a subject just by observation? So despite of using that observation technology or methodology, it is not possible to inference, it is not possible to understand meaning of that insider culture. Why? Because actually you are observing those things, but it is not possible to observe everything from outside because meaning is internal to the formation process. And there, a very important role can be seen in phenomenological perspective. Phenomenological perspective means, in general, it is going to be the knowledge formation behind an experience. That means the insider, that is the subject who's living that particular social phenomenon, is actually experiencing that particular social phenomenon. That means something, it is not just the reality that is outside, that is because that is a kind of superficial understanding where you are looking that this is a cultural practice, but actually you are not able to understand why are they doing this particular, why are they following this particular kind of practice from their tradition, and why is it this part of their tradition, why are they still attached with that particular cultural practice. So the whole issue is to seize the researchers' unsocialized nature into that insider or the subject's inside journey, that is also part of that particular social phenomenon. So overall, just in one sentence, if you want to understand philosophical formation of that knowledge, which is actually part of that particular subject. So, because it is inside of that subject, a researcher cannot observe it just by superficial kind of observation. It is a complicated process. That is why phenomenological perspective observes that if researcher is not rooted in the situation, that means despite of being there, the researcher will not be able to understand that particular process. That means empiricist gives greater focus on observation oriented investigation, and that means you are not able to understand the meaningful part of that particular process. That means in empirical scientific research, most of the time with their emphasis on observable empirical facts is basically to talk about the theory construction, or that means also a kind of another enhancement or the end part as how that theory can be different in a particular social setting. But actually researcher role in empirical research is going to be completely different in phenomenological perspective, because in phenomenological perspective observation is not only just a kind of non-participatory observation, it is also a kind of participatory observation in which you are, that means the researcher is supposed to be in touch, in flow of that social phenomenon, so that the researcher can understand the formation or the process of that social phenomenon. That means you have to capture the social reality as it is in flow. It is not a static thing like we are observing in a chemistry lab by using, by applying positivistic perspective. Rather, in this phenomenological perspective, research tool is going to not just cover the outer responses, outer responses of those particular subjects, rather the inner process of that particular subject is also very important and essential in phenomenological perspective. And that is why formal interviews are very important for in this phenomenological perspective. If you look at those formal perspectives, that can be semi structured or unstructured. Semi structured, why? Because phenomenological perspective says if you are going to talk to your subjects, like you are going to there, and you can't categorize all your questions, you because you are not aware about them. You can't claim that you know your subjects better, because basically you are outsider. So there has to be a flexible line of questions, and that we call semi structured. That means there are questions categorized roughly, but it is a kind of tentative structure, and you can change it. Like you are going there and you are in the process of in that engaging formal interviews, but actually you have found out something which you were not aware about that earlier. So systematically you can enter that particular category, a new category, and that is why it is called semi structured. But what is the advantage of formal interview? In observation, it is only the researcher who is observing a particular social phenomenon from the outside. But in the formal interview, you got the freedom. You get the freedom as to why are you doing it? Okay, have your father have been has your father been part of this process? Similarly you are doing it. Okay, now you can understand the difference between two generations, so you can understand how things are changing through generations in related to that particular perspective of that a particular social process. That means formal interviews gives you engaging kind of experience by facilitating opportunities of more engagement that you were actually missing in observation. And basically these formal interviews cannot be repeated as it is. That is why sometimes those scientific methodologies coming from positivistic perspective don't like this kind of formal interviews. But in phenomenological perspective, these formal interviews can provide you very in-depth and deep analysis of that meaning of that cultural practice of a particular, so kind of traditional practice that is going on there generation by generation. Now the question comes, why do we need it? We need it because in rural development, we consider just one concept. I am just giving you just one example. Let's note it down. You have to be very clear cut about community perception. Concept of, I am writing it simultaneously in the chat box. Community perception is a concept which is very important in rural development. Community perception can work like, you can note it down here, because we also have to understand by using certain examples. Otherwise these things will be completely sound like alien or something that we can't relate to. So this is the idea. We are using it, community perception, for example, or for a case in point. You can't change a community's community perception just by going there or by your programs. Let's accept the limitation of our development perspective. But If you know about this community perception, that means you can understand the cause of a certain barrier that actually can be worked creatively in your development paradigm. So, this community perception is very important, but there is no other way to go to this community perception unless and until you are applying this kind of phenomenological perspective, because that gives you a complete in-depth insight uh, in your subjects. And that can be very useful for developing one alternative, or to find out why one particular program is not doing better in that particular province while it is doing better in other provinces of India or Afghanistan. So apart from observation, formal interviews are very important in phenomenological perspective. So these are very important such tools. Then analysis of personal and institutional documents and published literatures are also very important here. It is a kind of we all must be aware about institutional documents and published literature, but nowadays analysis of these personal documents, this is recently got the vibe of that particular social research area, in the sense that it would uh, provide you a kind of eye opener for some incident which is actually not recorded officially, but it was very important. And it is important in the sense that sometimes very important incidences of local history are very important, but the problem with local history is that because they are in their native language, that is why most of the time they are ignored, because nobody was aware. The outside researcher was not very good in that particular language, native language. So those documents of personal, those are actually providing you local history and a very good understanding in that particular society or the culture or the phenomenon or the community perception. Then there will be more chances, better chances. That means, again, I'm writing it in your uh, inbox, why it is useful nowadays. One is oral history, HIST, oral history, and that we sometimes also called as local history. So everything cannot be recorded. That is why sometimes personal documents can also help us. So overall insistence of phenomenological perspective is just one, that not a single opportunity of getting in that knowledge formation of your subjects should be avoided, should be ruined. It has to be incorporated. That means there must be a very liberal room for these chances of collecting a kind of empirical verification. So this is something that makes phenomenological perspective very valuable for social research area in general and rural development in particular. Then there are also certain other analytical techniques, and there are also that are being considered very useful, like ethnographic interpretation, because they are going to give you the whole community's history and the overall living, incorporating all the aspects of a particular community, that we called ethnography. Because in ethnography we don't just focus on one dimension, rather we consider that as a community, and those are also covered with their different dimensions, because the community shares lots of things, not only views, but they are also coming through several practices, like practices those are actually part of their everyday life as a community. So only because of though that kind of ethnography, you'll be more able to understand their meanings, their values, their cultural significance, and then you can understand what are barriers or what can be turned as a strength for your development alternative. Then historical reconstruction, action research, multivariate analysis, and semiological analysis. Everything is written there, but we have to understand why are we talking about it, so that we can enhance, we can evolve our chances of empirical verification, not by categorizing us into a particular routine kind of research tool. Rather, phenomenological perspective is providing us a whole new range of these research tools. So let's talk about this kind of empirical research, which is actually part of which phenomenological perspective. What are key characteristics, and why are we talking about it as a very valuable kind of perspective in social research? So first of all, I told you, like I have given you an example, community perception, because when you are going to talk about community perception, you can identify what kind of concepts can be taken in that particular research as a key area. Sometimes there can be a new types of concepts, a new type of formations, a new type of culture practice that can be not that maybe you are not aware about that because you are an outsider. But despite of that, you have to understand your theory or your basic perspective has to be related with it somehow. So first, in our first attempt, we try to understand how can we bind these concepts in our particular research. And number two, of course, it is a flexible kind of thing, but still, researcher has to define her or his concepts that you are going to use with precision. For example, let's take an example. When we were talking about a child rights based study, we were conducting a child rights study, and we were trying to understand who are those children. Those are going to be the most marginalized, because we were willing to identify who are the most vulnerable children. So we have to define this vulnerability in terms of measurable concepts, number one, as well as in terms of theoretical terms. So vulnerability in terms of survival, vulnerability in terms of health, vulnerability in terms of outcast or exclusion, vulnerability in terms of poor employment opportunities, vulnerability in terms of some sort of molestation chances. So you have to be very precise for defining those particular concepts. Second characteristic, that is of course objectivity, but here this objectivity is not compromised. It is not limited as it was experienced in positivistic methodology. In phenomenological perspective, uh, because you are an outsider, but actually you are trying to understand values or subjects, values of subjects through their own perspective. So you are actually covering values of subjects, but without affecting by your personal values. That means, being an Indian, I should not use my values to understand my subjects values. That means, as a researcher, my values are ceased to be as a researcher, because I have to use the frame of the perspective of my value, the subjects, rather than my own value. So here objectivity is not that neutral. It is actually uh, it is coming with value orientation in the sense, it is objective in the sense that researchers views or values are not involved, but at the same time It is not superficial. It is a complete kind of subjective understanding with objectivity, because in phenomenological research, the researcher is actually discovering values and significant cultural practices of those subjects. Those are actually insider. So here objectivity is a very different, completely, you can understand this. It is completely different that we consider objective in a particular strict sense of scientific methodology, that is coming in positivistic perspective. But yes, verifiability is very important, because since the beginning we have been talking about, of course, conclusions or facts can never be made full and final, but you can replicate, you can show that these subjects have been covered and these facts can be verified. That means it is a kind of scientific investigation that can be verified with help of that repetition of that particular response. Then predictability, of course, this is going to be a very limited in terms of research area, social research area, but with that particular precision, that is number one, that is the use of concept. With your precision based conceptualization, you can measure that particular vulnerability. So it is not true to say that we can't measure that predictability in rural development. Yes, you can. For instance, I have given you an example of community perception. If you are able to understand that societies, that subjects, your subjects community perception through their engagement with their particular knowledge formation, with that particular uh, the whole process through which actually they are going through when they are part of those cultural practices, that means yes, that accurate measurement of that particular understanding as community perception, we can quantify probability of our development alternative that we can provide in our diagnostic research or in our other type of conclusion. Then systematic interpretation. This systematic interpretation is basically aimed at flaws finding and fault finding, so that we can uh, uh, be a part of that self correction process in our scientific investigation. And that is why, again, the role of subjects, or I mean your subjects, that means the particular society in which you are there to study, uh, their perspective, their meanings, their values and their norms have to be the sole marker through which you are supposed to understand what is observable, what has to be quantifiable, and what has to be deducted from that study. It has nothing to do with the researcher, I mean myself, with the researcher's values or meanings. So, that only then you can arrive that kind of a set of propositions through which you can consider how this kind of cultural practices are facilitating good health or hampering good health. It is also just impossible to consider that all these cultural practices are actually a kind of barrier to good health. Maybe there are some sort of traditional practices, indigenous knowledge, traditional practices that are basically responsible for strengthening of that health status in a particular community. So you have to be completely free from bias. Now, uh, having spoken about it, now let's talk about phenomenology in theoretical terms. Till now, I was trying to make you understand by using those particular examples so that you can understand. But because this is also a theoretical program where you are supposed to write certain assignments, and that is why we also need some theoretical kind of understanding in this kind of perspective. But I'm almost sure that you guys are by now are enough to have enough understanding as a general. But now we are going to define that in particular theoretical terms. So this phenomenology is basically coming from this philosophical person who was a very big name in the field of philosophy, and his name is Edmund Husserl. So Edmund Husserl's phenomenology is basically philosophical phenomenology, and he was saying that any any scientific method is basically inappropriate if it is not going to cover the process of human thought and human action. That means he was the first person who questions the quantitative methodology of positivistic approach. He says facts are okay, but it has to be covered with subjective understanding in the subjects. That means a good ethnography can be a good investigation equally as you were promoting that in scientific methodology. Why? Because basically, what people are going through, what they are living in their everyday life, is better to explain because they are going through that particular process, and without being engaged with that particular process, no researcher can identify the cause. Then how can he or she explain that particular cause? That means the whole claim of this philosophical phenomenology as propounded by Edmund Husserl was to shun off, to break the cycle of this facts and observable facts, because he was saying knowledge it's not that kind of knowledge that is available on the surface. Lots of knowledge is basically as part of human thought, human action, human mind, human consciousness. So unless and until you are going to be part of that, and you are not going to be to engage in that particular process of human thought and knowledge and action and everyday activities, how can you explain that particular cause? That is actually a very shallow kind of scientific methodology. So he started developing a kind of alternative. So the whole idea behind this philosophical phenomenology of Edmund Husserl was that he was interested to understand reality more in words rather than in numbers. That we call it qualitative understanding and quantitative understanding. So quantitative understanding is just uh, one dimension of social reality, and phenomenology starts talking about the qualitative aspect of social understanding, because that is going to be the biggest part of social research area in general, and uh, in rural development area, in areas of rural development in particular. So the whole difference between science, that is positivistic methodology or positivistic perspective, and phenomenological perspective, is actually the claim that science claims that behavior can be objectively measurable, but phenomenology says the behavior which is overt, you can observe overt behavior, but actually with the behavior which is coming outside, it is coming from inside. So half of that particular behavior is the inside process, and unless and until you are going to be engaged with that process, you can't understand the actual cause behind that explanation. That means it is a kind of in positivistic perspective, although they try to objectify facts, but actually this is a shallow kind of scientific investigation because it has limitations. So phenomenology has started to work on those limitations, because they say that the experience, the perception, it is no doubt the action and overt behavior can be observed, but actually it is part of uh, the behavior which is coming from inside. You can observe outside, but what is going inside is more important than what you can observe from the outside. So engaging with that subject by several methods that we have discussed earlier. Again, we are going to back to that particular slide. Uh, yes, there is a list of many research tools that are actually part of phenomenological empirical research, and they talk about how you try to break those limitations that are actually posed on researcher in the name of scientific inquiry. So this kind of scientific inquiry is basically limited. So phenomenology has started working on those limitations. Then second, science claims that we are talking about science of society. That means discovery of social laws can be made possible. But phenomenology says if you are going to focus on meaning, if you are going to focus on the process of that knowledge formation, if you are going to focus on the subjectivity of your subjects, that means a whole variance, and you can't go for sweeping generalizations that mean discovery of laws is just a myth. You can't uh, develop just one perspective for all those societies, because every society is different in that particular process of gaining meaning, living meaning in everyday life, because their values and norms are basically different from society to society in a particular period of time. And even within a society they vary, because due to two separate periods of time. So that has to be the part of your social reality. Otherwise, despite of your claim for social reality, you will not be able to understand the change and dynamics in that social reality. So science, that means positivistic perspective, is basically promoting facts, observable facts that are concluded by observing behavior from the outside. But phenomenology says this is just half, not even the half, the partial part of your subjects, because the whole behavior which is actually observed as their overt behavior is actually part of the consciousness of people. So let's try to focus on the knowledge formation of that process, and that goes in everyday life of your subjects. Now, uh, do we need time for prayers, or you are free to tell me about that? About what time should we take that prayer break?
Yes, ma'am. I think it's time to take a
Okay,
break.
okay. So let's take a break of 10 minutes, and after that we'll be resuming. Okay. Thank you. So can we resume? Can we resume this session?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So, having spoken about phenomenological perspective at length, now we are going to general understanding in those various types of phenomenological perspective, and that is the going to be the first one is hermeneutical for phenomenology. Hermeneutical phenomenology is basically a kind of meaning, decoding a kind of meaning from the text or from a particular narrative. It can be a local history, it can be oral history, it can be a local myth, it can be part of that particular indigenous knowledge, and one has to, the researcher has to derive the meaning from that particular text. So the text is basically going to give you a basic understanding in the consciousness of those particular of people belonging to that particular society. So in hermeneutical phenomenology, we try to understand the hidden meaning, the tacit meaning in the mythology, in the folk tales of a particular society, or the village history of a particular society, or the clan history. There are so many narratives that are actually part of their general process, their general consciousness as community. So the researcher has to identify that inseparable link that actually gives the researcher basic understanding into the community perception of that particular society. So this is all about the hermeneutical phenomenology. And then the second is transpersonal phenomenology. It is somewhat different from hermeneutical in the sense that this is the process, this is the experience which is not uh, related to your everyday routine or everyday life of that particular society. In this sense, this is a kind of extraordinary experience where uh, sometimes tribal societies, sometimes those village communities, they try to they they explore their own area, their own indigenous beliefs as a part of their healing practices, or some sort of ceremonial practices that gives them a kind of different experience. But in this transpersonal experience means the researcher is not going to observe that extraordinary experience of that particular healing, or that particular living a legend kind of theory. Rather, that he has to be actively engaged in that process, so that these out of body experiences or visions or healings, or mystical experiences can be experienced by the researcher, and he can understand that also this is a part of their experience, their knowledge, their indigenous practices. So still, you can't just prove them null and white just because those are unique patterns of understanding that are unique, that are limited, that are exclusive to one particular society. And for that understanding, uh, in your also in your text part, you will get this case study where Laserman basically had studied this transpersonal phenomenology by working on a particular healing technique that was popular in Malay healers. In this Malay region, they were following a kind of engine procedure that gives the victim, that gives the, or the ego is the more appropriate term to describe this kind of experience. In this process, the ego has to go through complete a very long phase of healing rituals. And when the researcher, I mean the ledgerman, he was she was interested to know about that particular practice, but then they just didn't allow her just as a particular talk of this topic. Rather, they promoted that we can't explain this kind of experience to you. Only you have to understand it by going through that healing procedure yourself. So when she finally undertook this Angin procedure of Malay healers, she experienced a very different kind of energy level, and she was also lived that kind of experience, and she could explain how something which is actually a metaphorical description of it can be a kind of metaphorical description for an outsider, but actually it is a kind of living experience or the real experience for that particular community. That means in transpersonal phenomenology, something unique, something traditional practice or indigenous knowledge that can be also part of your knowledge, because without just labeling something as it is not, again it is something against those theories that we have read so till days. If that is going beyond that theory, let's not to call it null and void unless and until you are going to empirically verify. So, transpersonal phenomenology gives another chance to the researcher to go through that extraordinary kind of thing, and they are not distinguishing this kind of experiences just in the name of metaphorical description. Rather, they are giving you a good opportunity to empirically verify those metaphorical description as well, because those are also part of various indigenous um, or native societies in living in different parts across this world. Now, the more general kind of social phenomenology, because very this is akin to our anthropological and sociological understanding, and it is originated through Alfred Schutz. Alfred Schutz was also under the tremendous influence of Edmund Husserl, but actually Husserl's approach was purely philosophical, while Alfred Schutz advocated the study of society. That means he has evolved a sociological paradigm out of that philosophical phenomenology, and he calls it intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity means he says that there are various ways through which communities develop this kind of intersubjectivity so that they can understand meaning. So, in the process of creating a particular meaning related to a particular social phenomenon, one ego, when he or she is basically interacting with the alter, so both are actually engaged in that process of intersubjectivity. That means both are exchanging their perspectives, and in this process that meaning is actually going through a lot of changes, and that gives a kind of understanding why intergenerational issues look at those things, the same things, from a different perspective. And this is very important to understand how this time, this generational gap, this legacy, this is going to play, or this is going to affect that social phenomenon or those cultural or ceremonial practices. And what are the key factors behind this? So, social phenomenology is basically anthropological, or you may call it sociological part of sociological dimension of a phenomenological perspective. Then let's talk about another perspective which is much more um, prominent and much more popular in anthropology, which is neurophenomenology. Neurophenomenology is basically, first of all, it comes in two steps. First step, they just try to engage with the cross cultural evidence. That means, suppose we were talking about Malay healers practice, so there can be another kind of healing practice which is popular in the tribal groups of Andaman and Nicobar that belongs to Indian continent. So there can be seen a kind of cross-cultural evidence of that healing practices of those particular communities. And then in the second step, we try to explore the universal structure of experience as how they treat ceremonial practices as healing experience to a particular society. So in that case, we are actually trying to compare and then try to universalize those structure by or based on the basis of our empirical verification. It is not imaginary. That is why it is coming in neurophenomenology. And why are we calling it neurophenomenology? Because anthropological studies are proving that the general because general structure of the major architect of all that function that are going in your mind is basically the brain. And that is why neuroscience provides a kind of another dimension. And then this is called as neurophenomenology. So phenomenological anthropology and sociology provide a kind of cross-cultural laboratory. But then in the second step, we have to explore those universal structures of experience so that we can identify what are the common features and how can we scientifically derive common features of those experiences. And that is why we call it neurophenomenology. Then the basic contribution behind neurophenomenology, because it looks like something not familiar to most of us. It is important to understand that overall we share a kind of consciousness. All of these societies, anthropological, by and several studies, these anthropologists have proved that most of the time there are certain things that cannot be explained by those routine scientific discourse, by those uh, dogmatic kind of positivistic theories or perspectives. So there you need some sort of ethnographic field work and ethnological theory. Only then you can create those contributions in the name of neurophenomenology. And again, it is coming as a very refreshing and complete kind of experience, because without that neurophenomenology, we will not be able to understand it in the form of deducing those experiences as a universal structure of brain at all. So this is all about those phenomenological approaches. And now there is a kind of another example, a case in point, is how we try to understand differently when you apply positivistic method on differential educational attainment. For example, we are conducting a survey or some sort of experimental research design on a group of students, and definitely we are getting those all students are not doing very well. So how do you explain in differential educational attainment, that is the variance in the performance of education among those students? So basically, what is the difference? This slide is basically focusing to make you realize how things differ. So positivistic approach basically says few things about set standard patterns, like they consider it that individuals reacting to external stimuli. So they think that actually this is a kind of class structure or parents, those are working very well with their children, those children are performing very well, but they have little say in the matter, because there are so many factors that are not included in that observable positivistic approach. For example, a teacher's differential approach can also alter performance of different students in one class. That is completely different, because you are focusing on only those limited factors. But phenomenological perspective phenomenological perspective says that behavior is not only shaped by external forces to individuals, rather there can be several other factors. That student is basically suffering from some sort of negligence, not as determined by those factors, but their socio-cultural processes are actually left, because you are considering all students from one background, but actually their socio-cultural background is different. So for instance, if that student's mother language is not English, and they are educating that particular class in particular English only in one medium, that student is going to suffer. And he's suffering or she's suffering, not because not because he is not good in studies, rather he's good in studies, but actually the medium is creating a kind of problem, because her mother tongue is not English. So there are so many factors that are actually left ignored. But in phenomenological methods, we basically try to incorporate uh, those uh, those factors as well. So the overall understanding of phenomenological perspective says that man actively constructs social reality. That means this social reality is not going to be common and universal for all the members of a single society. Why? Because due to their socio-cultural background, these different individuals can construct different kind of social reality. For example, a girl who is getting scolded every day by her teacher may develop a kind of a strong resistance, not only to her teacher but also to her studies. And she will be reluctant in her studies, and she will be saying like, my teacher doesn't like me. So she will be actually losing that interest in not only in studies but also in communications. So that is why the whole process of phenomenology is basically focusing on several things, and that can be understood by just one statement, that meanings are created, developed, modified, and changed in this process of negotiation. And interestingly, this process of negotiation, what Alfred Schut calls intersubjectivity, exchanging of this attitude, exchanging of our perspective to negotiate our meaning, is actually not that equal to for all the members of a society. So we have to incorporate these factors as well. Now, we have to talk about another two types of perspectives in short. One is critical paradigm and the other is descriptive research. Similarly, like phenomenological perspective in critical paradigm, we actually, again, this is a kind of perspective in which we try to understand critically the rules of theory and the practices in the process of knowledge production. So still our focus is not losing from knowledge production. We are considering it as a process of knowledge production, but actually we are trying to uh, develop an alternative uh, dimension of understanding by critically analyzing that particular theory. Uh, so far, if there is anything important, you can raise any question if someone willing to, or we can proceed. Okay, I guess there is no question. So let's summarize these also two perspectives in short. So basically, critical paradigm is very important in the sense that it contains as possible as minimum set of concepts with which researcher operates, but actually it helps to sensitize the researcher that he has not to narrow down the scientific understanding, but actually he has also to narrow down his own political and ideological implications, because again, error free or bias free are sounding different, but most of the time as a researcher we are not aware about our political inclinations and our ideological orientations, and despite of our best efforts, sometimes our political and ideological inclinations affect our study. So this is the whole process that works just as a barrier in critical paradigm, because in critical paradigm basically uh, they are focusing on critical examination, so that you can facilitate the whole cross tabulation of all those significant concepts, and you can understand whether those concepts are actually worth are worthy or not, are they fungible or not, are they falsifiable or not. So this is the process by which a researcher can logically, rigorously can work for the codification of the whole qualitative understanding in, and this is a very full-fledged process of uh, challenging almost all significant concept in the process. Uh, And if you look at the basic elements of a paradigm, those are written, but I just want to focus on two. First is praxis, the fourth one. The praxis. Praxis means a combination of theory and practice. That means, again, without a theory, a critical paradigm cannot be developed, and as far as possible, just a theory cannot help you to develop a critical paradigm. Through by working on your critical paradigm, you have to empirically verify that whether this understanding that you have concluded is consistent with the theory or inconsistent with the theory. If it is consistent with the theory, why is it consistent with the theory? And if it is inconsistent, then why is it inconsistent with the theory? And the last one is very important, that is deconstruction and reconstruction. In critical paradigm, we are not just talking about deconstruction. This is going to be the partial perspective or the half perspective to reality if we are only trying to deconstruct rather than just reconstruct. So the deconstruction and reconstruction both are actually two processes completing the whole cycle, because the nature of reconceptualization process emerges only as the illusion of the existing taken for granted structure is relieved. Sometimes we take it for granted, and that kind of understanding, it actually coming naturally, it looks like it is coming naturally, and we are observing it as a very easily apparent trend. But there is a need to understand as why there is no linear significant there is no linear sequence of those significant events. So whether those events, those are occurring in that particular, those are related in that social phenomenon, or whether they are fully inconsistent with inconsistency with that particular trend or not. So in this critical research process, you are supposed to break down your research, and at every step you have to deconstruct the whole understanding and to question your overall general understanding, so that we can't uh, conclude by casual kind of logical inference. So the whole process of deconstruction and reconstruction focuses on three questions: how does it persist, how nothing is done about it, and how is that people accept what clearly is not in their interest. This kind of praxeological understanding would suffice our understanding as to what is the actual process. So you can say the process of identifying the knowledge formation is same in phenomenological perspective and in critical paradigm, but the difference is that the whole process in phenomenological perspective was focusing on the understanding the philosophy behind that knowledge formation. But in critical paradigm, the whole process is uh, rooted in questioning that particular process. How is it happening? Why is it happening? And if it is happening, what are key factors that are still facilitating this kind of particular social phenomenon? So the basic difference between phenomenological and critical paradigm is that the essence of the critical appraisal in this particular approach. And here we can talk about certain types of critical research. Critical case study, it's not just a case study which is in-depth interviewing with the case study group, but at the same time they are again focusing on the second point, that is how does it persist, how nothing is done about it, and how is it that people accept what clearly is not in their interest. But radical historicism, the another theory is the another approach in radical research is radical historicism. In this, they try to reconstruct the past in terms of the present, and they try to understand how those factors play the decisive role, or it was just a subsistent role. So they can understand by radical historicism the role of those particular factors, so that they can understand whether facts can be verified empirically or not. Again, it is is done in the form of actions. Then again, like we have already discussed in ethnological perspective, we were talking about ethnography, but here in critical paradigm we are just adding this suffix as critical ethnography. Critical ethnography is again questioning their that taken for granted contradiction, taken for granted myths, to question that particular process as how this kind of knowledge formation is working behind that particular social phenomenon, and how can these contradictions can be negotiated or myths represented. So the overall the just one fine line between this critical paradigm perspective and phenomenological perspective is the critical essence of this approach. There are certain structural techniques here. This is going to be very important technique, so let's take a few minutes for this. Semiological analysis is very important nowadays. uh, the semiological overall semiological analysis is basically focusing on two things. First is the signifier, and the second is signified. Signifier, that means a sound or image which signifies something. Like I say horse, the sound of horse or the image of horse, but signified is four-legged animal. But sometimes we take it for granted, but can you pronounce the same thing with in a population which is completely alien to that particular signifier? They call horse something else. That means the sound, the signifier, is not going to help them to relate with their reality. Although they are familiar with the horse, that is the signified. But actually, the signifier is changed. So because the signifier is changed, that means they will not be able to understand despite of their familiarity with the signified. So this is the whole purpose behind structured technique. They try to identify what cultural symbol conveys what particular meaning. So this is a kind of intrinsic a process that goes for intrinsic meaning in sign itself. The sign in itself is more important than the signifier, because a signifier can be changed from society to society. So there is a need to understand that sign is the concrete relation between concept, that is the signified, and the sound or image, that is the signifier. This is a very important technique. It is being used for ethnography purpose particularly. Then another perspective, which is again a very wide perspective, that comes as descriptive research. It is a very general kind of understanding, but it is very important because the aim of descriptive research is focusing on what exists with respect to variable or conditions in a situation. Here, application of descriptive research is easier as compared to critical paradigm, because they examine the problematic situation from the beginning by defining their hypothesis, and then they try to understand how many variables are important, and they select appropriate subject and source material. So comparatively, this descriptive research is nowadays very popular because uh, despite of that quantitative understanding, descriptive research is being considered as very valuable for qualitative understanding. And nowadays development lexicon is promoting qualitative research as well, although earlier they were very focused on uh, quantitative data and statistical data. But right now you can say that the qualitative understanding, qualitative studies are also being very popular nowadays. So there is not much has to be discussed about descriptive research. There will be much more things that we can discuss in coming days. But yes, in terms of types of descriptive research, we have to understand survey studies. Survey studies means, again, in order to ascertain a status, determining the adequacy of a status by comparing it with those particular categorized standards that are actually enumerated by the researcher in the beginning of the study. These survey studies are very useful for evaluation or the appraisal of a particular development program in rural area. Then analysis of the document. Nowadays this content analysis is very important, because analysis of document is being very popular, because sometimes data is not sufficient to reflect the reality as it exists in the field. That is why sometimes you found data that is actually showing some sort of variance, and then this content analysis, this informal analysis, this informational analysis comes a very profitable. And one more thing, oral history and life history of a person, with help of certain letters, with help of certain documents, can also be included in this part. So for instance, different strategies collecting similar data don't always use exactly the same classificatory system. In that case, you need some other sort of qualitative research as well, and that we call an content analysis, and that is part of the descriptive research. Then of course, there are correlational studies and causal comparative studies. Those are basically controlled kind of studies, in which we try to understand what variations can be manipulated or can be introduced in one variable, while other variable is limited in its variations. So this kind of descriptive research are also can be statistically tested, but at the same time they are giving you a full-fledged analysis with their subjective understanding. That is why they are part of this descriptive research. Then of course another part is experimental research, which is of course has limited scope in social research area, but still we cannot rule out its importance, because the overall idea behind experimental research is controlled observation. That means in this, observation is controlled because manipulation or control is going to be practiced in case of one independent variable, so that you can understand how other variables are going to perform, are going to affect the conclusion of the research. So this is a kind of experimental research design. Then there are certain designs of experimental research, and those are not very complicated to understand. So I am just winding up today's discussion here, and these are very simple, but still you have any, in case you have any problem, we can discuss it again in coming sessions. But here I just want to uh, ask all of you, request all of you to have a very vibrant kind of session by incorporating your reflections, observations, and queries, of course, if there is any. So now I would like to listen you all. Please welcome. You are welcome. Please come forward or write in the inbox and take help of Naved. Naved, can you please do this for me?
Sure, ma'am. In case there is any question, I will be there.
Apart from this question, you can also have that deliberation kind of discussion with your friends in your particular native language, if you want that.
Sure, ma'am. If in case they need that, we will discuss.
Yeah, please. Otherwise, I can describe few things that I have been. Uh,
Yes, ma'am. You can just stop the recording, then we just start the discussion.
okay, okay. From where I have to record, stop recording.
The same place where you started the recording.
I cannot find out. I don't know. Maybe.
You can just go to the three dot
Yeah, I
there.
am in there.
The manage
Then
recording. Yeah,
Okay,
in
okay. I
yeah.
was just missing it. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Stop recording.